Hi, I'm Esther, and in this video, I'm going to talk you through 3 different ways to make your own bias binding.
If you're unsure what bias binding is, it's simply a strip of woven fabric that's been cut at a 45-degree angle. Being cut on the bias, or that 45-degree angle, gives it a slight stretch that can mold around edges and has a bit of give to it. So we can then use it as a trim to neatly finish seams or any raw edge on garments or any other sewing project.
I'll walk you through each method so that you can decide which would be the most suitable, and then I'll talk you through how to attach it to your project. Let's get stuck in.
I'm going to start by lightly pressing my fabric because I want it to be nice and flat. Next, we need to find the bias of the fabric, which is a 45-degree angle from the selvage. I find the easiest way to do this is to make sure that my cut edge of fabric is 90 degrees to the selvage, so that's a clean right angle, which means when I fold it in half, I should create a 45-degree angle on that diagonal fold. Once you have that 45-degree angle, find a way to mark it either by using a marking tool or pressing it with an iron to form a light crease. Here I've actually cut along my bias line, so my fabric now is the shape of a triangle, but it doesn't matter whether yours is a square or a triangle as long as you've found that bias line, because now we're going to make markings along that same diagonal line depending on how wide you would like your bias binding to be. Mine's going to be 2 inches, so I'm using a ruler to mark 2 inches all along that bias line, and that's going to create the line which we cut to make our bias tape. Now you can simply cut along that line using shears or a rotary cutter. I find that this method is great if you don't need too much bias binding. Otherwise, I'm going to show you another method to create a bulk lot, and then I'll show you how to join all the strips together to create a continuous roll of binding. This bulk method of cutting bias tape works best if your fabric is roughly a square shape. It doesn't have to be exact, but I did find that it was helpful. It also depends how large your fabric is in regards to how much bias tape you'll end up with, as well as what width you would like your binding to be. Mine's going to be 2 inches. My fabric width was roughly 150 centimeters, and it was a square, so the other side was also roughly 150 centimeters. And that should create over 40 meters of binding. So to begin, we need the cut ends of our fabric to be squared off at 90 degrees and be perfectly straight. A simple way to do this is to fold your fabric in half so that the selvages are aligned, and then using a right angle ruler, square up from your selvage to create a perfect 90-degree angle. You can then mark that line and cut it with scissors, or you can use a rotary cutter to get a really nice clean straight line. At this point, you should also trim off the selvages of your fabric, which I forgot to do. So it's not the end of the world if you forget, but if you trim them off now, it will save you trimming them all off separately later on. Do the same for the other cut end of your fabric, so all 4 corners of your fabric should be 90 degrees. Now we're going to fold the fabric in half like this, lining up one of your cut edges with one of the selvage edges so that it looks like a big triangle. I clearly lied when I said that my fabric was a square, because it's not. So if your fabric was a square, you'll have a perfect triangle, and if it's not square like mine, it's completely fine. We can continue in the same way. We're going to fold this in half again so that it forms an even smaller triangle. If your fabric was not a perfect square and it looks like mine, then continue folding the fabric over until your edges are aligned. Note again that I forgot to cut my selvage off, so that's why you can see that rough selvage edge, but otherwise it should be a clean cut edge. This corner should be a right angle, so take the time to double check that and check that your other corners are 45-degree angles. For the final fold, we'll take this other corner and fold that over towards the 90-degree corner. This final fold is just to make the fabric smaller in size so that you can hopefully fit your ruler across it if you're using a rotary cutter to help you slice those strips. Double check that corner is 90 degrees, and then I actually used an iron to press it down really lightly to make sure that all the fabric was aligned underneath. I repositioned my fabric on the table so it was easier to film and also easier to access this edge. We're going to slice off the end of this edge so that it's nice and straight, and we're going to begin cutting our bias from that edge. I jumped the gun a bit and started marking lines, so just ignore those chalk lines for now. We want to slice off this edge so that it's nice and clean and straight, and that's going to be the edge we start cutting our bias from. Now you can either use your ruler and your rotary cutter to directly cut all of your bias strips. Otherwise, if you're a little uncoordinated with your rotary cutter like I am, then you can draw in your bias strip lines and then use scissors to cut it. Take your time cutting up all of your strips until you have enough for your project or until you've finished all your fabric. Now you should have a ton of strips, and it might be worthwhile sorting them into different sizes. Some of the strips might be short and some might be really long, so it's up to you if you'd like to do all the short ones together or all the long ones, or put the short ones in between the long ones. To sew the strips together, we're going to place the short diagonal edges together so that they sit at a right angle. If your fabric has a very clear right and wrong side, make sure that your right sides are together. The seam allowance doesn't have to be exact, but roughly 6 mil, or the width of the edge of your foot, should work, which is 1/4 of an inch. And we'll be stitching straight across that diagonal. It's not entirely necessary to back tack each time we start a new join, so once you get the hang of things, you can actually just continuously sew in a straight line and line up your pieces of fabric as you go. It's up to you again if you can get the feel of it. You don't even have to pin them, you can just line them up as you go. We don't want our binding to be bulky, so we're going to open the seams and press them. If you forgot to cut off your selvage like me, or if you have uneven edges, trim them off about 1/4 of an inch or 6 mil and then press them open. You can also snip off the little triangles that show on either side of the binding. Those were the first 2 methods for making bias binding, and now I'm going to show you a third. A little heads up, this was by far my least favorite binding method. It really took such a long time. Meg did warn me that this wasn't her favorite method, and now I can totally see why. I've seen the reels, I've seen the TikToks, and it looks so straightforward and it looks easy. I really highly recommend the previous method if you're wanting to make bulk bias binding. It's really a lot easier than this one, but look, if you want to go ahead and try, be my guest.
This is going to take forever.
So firstly, let's pretend that my fabric is one piece, just a square shape. Your fabric can be either a square shape or a rectangle shape. It needs to have 90-degree corners. Next, we need to find the bias line again, which is a 45-degree angle. If your fabric is a perfect square, you should be able to fold it in half and find your bias line that way. Otherwise, as long as your cut edge is straight and your corners are 90 degrees, you should be able to fold your cut edge up to your selvage and find your 45-degree angle that way. Cut along that bias line and you should now have 2 pieces. Now we're going to move the pieces side by side so that they form a parallelogram. Be careful if your fabric has right and wrong sides, because we're going to be sewing these 2 pieces together. Once sewn, it should look something like this, and we're going to turn it over and press that seam open with an iron. Now we can draw in guidelines using chalk or an erasable marker. I've only just realized that I should have drawn my guidelines on the wrong side of my fabric. So take note of where your seam allowance is, and you want to be drawing your guidelines on the wrong side. My binding width was 1¼ inches. So depending on your project, you might require a wider width, such as 2 inches. This process takes a little while, and I will admit that my lines started to get skewed, which meant that I wasn't really drawing them accurately. So do be careful, you might have the same issue. It's not the end of the world, but it's also not ideal. So you do want to try and be as accurate as you can. I trimmed that part off to hide my mistake, and we're going to sew it into a tube shape. I found this part really tricky and really fiddly. The concept is to join the end of bias tape 1 with the beginning of bias tape 2. So I'm going to mark the top of bias tape 2 with chalk so that it's nice and noticeable, and also the bottom of bias tape 1, so those 2 points need to join together. You can also use a numbering method, so number off from 1 to wherever you end up all across the top of each of your strips, and then number off the bottom of each of your strips, moving your numbers across one number and then matching them up as you go. I just found that wasn't really necessary, because as long as you line up that first one, the rest of your strips should line up, and I found the trickiest part was doing the first one anyway. Once you get the first one, the rest line up really well. I folded my seam allowance to the inside because I drew my guidelines on the right side of my fabric. So if you've done it correctly and drawn your guidelines on the wrong side of your fabric, then your seam allowance should be on the outside of your loop and it should be a little bit easier to pin together. If you drew your guidelines on the right side like I did, you'll just have to pin on the inside of the loop as I'm doing here. And now we can sew those edges together all the way down. Now all that's left to do is press that seam open and cut along all of our guidelines. You should be able to cut in one continuous line so that you end up with one super long strip of bias binding. I don't know why I found this so awkward to cut, and it took a really long time because you can't use a rotary cutter in this method, you have to use scissors, but maybe you'll find it easier than I did. Those are the 3 methods for making your bias binding. Now I'll walk you through how to attach it to your garment. Firstly, we have to make sure we have the right side of our binding because there are little seam allowances there. Make sure you've got the right side and place that face down, right sides together with the edge that you're binding. Pin as you go, and if you're binding a curved edge like I am here, you can carefully ease the binding around the curved edge. Here I'm using a 2-inch binding, so if your binding is narrower or wider, your seam allowance might be different. But in this example, mine is 2 inches wide and I'm doing a 3/8 seam allowance, which is about 1 centimeter from the raw edge. Once sewn, we're going to press the seam allowance away from the garment. Here you can see the wrong side of my fabric and I'm going to press that seam allowance outwards. Now I'm going to fold over that raw edge of the binding about 1 centimeter and then fold it over again so that it encloses all of that seam allowance, and we want it to just cover that first line of stitching that we've already done. Pin it down and then repeat this process for all of your binding. It should be looking like this, and we have 2 options to finish off the binding. You can hand stitch it using an invisible slip stitch or a ladder stitch, or you can stitch it on the machine. If you're using a machine, we're basically going to top stitch where I've pinned those white pins along that edge. We're going to sew it from the right side, so you might find it easier to transfer your pins to the right side of your garment so that you can see where you're sewing and make sure that your pins are still holding everything in place. As you sew, you should be catching the underside of your binding where you can see my pins are coming through on the wrong side. Once pinned, I find it helpful to give it a light press so it helps the binding stay in place as I start sewing. This is how it should look on the right side, and then this is how it should look on the wrong side. Ideally, I would like to get a little bit closer to that edge, but it is difficult to catch that edge without losing it, so just a bit of practice and I think I'll get it a little bit closer. Those are the basics of attaching the binding to your garments. There are a few tips that I can share when you're binding inner seams because they might be more bulky. The process is the same, but there are a few little tips and tricks that might help you. Let's pretend I'm sewing the Hovia jacket and I'm choosing to use quite a thick padded fabric. My seam is going to be 5/8 and my binding is only 3/8, so that's why you can see a difference here between my sewing lines. So note that if you are sewing the Hovia jacket and you would like your binding to align with your seam, you need to trim back the seam allowance from your jacket pieces before you attach your binding. However, in this tutorial, we're going to continue with the binding and the seam lines not aligning. The only difference in attaching the binding with bulky seams is that we want to trim back some of the seam allowance so that there's less bulk that needs to be contained within the binding. This just involves trimming back your seam allowance about 1/4 inch, and then we can continue by pressing the binding outwards and repeat the same process as before. The last thing to mention are the ways to join your binding around continuous edges, such as a neckline or an armhole. The first way is to fold back the edge of your binding about 1/4 inch, then you can overlap the part of binding that you're hoping to join over the top of that. Pin it in place and then you can attach all of the binding as per usual. The second option is this. Once you have pinned your binding all around your garment, you can remove a couple of pins either side of the join, then pinch the binding ends together so that they perfectly align with the garment. You can pin the pieces together and check that they align, then we can sew those 2 binding pieces together so that they're joined. Trim back the seam allowance, press the seam open, and now we can attach the binding as per usual.
I hope that you found this video useful. You can also refer to the blog posts on Megan's website. She has some very in-depth written down instructions with images that might be more helpful if you got stuck along the way. Otherwise, leave a comment and we can do our best to help you. Don't forget to tag us in your makes. We love to see how your projects turn out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye.